Our second lesson in our textbook focuses on reading and writing numbers. We focused a little bit last lesson on reading numbers. This lesson's really going to focus on the writing component and the 3 different ways that we can write those numbers. So let's take a look. We have 3 different ways that we can write our numbers. We have standard form, word form, and expanded form. Standard form is your everyday way that you write a number. It's how we see numbers on a daily basis. We see them in this standard form, or it's just the number way that you write the numbers. So if we take a look at the number 26,321, this is our standard form. It's just the standard way to write a number. Our word form is how we say our numbers, 26,321. And the reason why I wrote these in 2 different colors is because they're 2 different periods. We talked about periods a little bit last lesson. A period is separated by our commas. Our period are our thousands periods and our ones periods. Those are mainly the periods that we're going to focus on. You also have your millions periods or your billions periods, but we're really going to focus on those 2 main periods, our thousands and our ones. Our periods have 3 sections to them. They have the hundreds, tens, and ones. All periods have those 3 sections. Now, if we looked at the 26, we'll say, oh, well, there are only 2. That's right, but there is another one over here before we would move to our next comma. So those commas are placed every 3 numbers, and those commas separate our periods. We'll talk more about periods in a bit. And then we have our expanded form. So we've gone over standard form, we've gone over word form. Expanded form are those number bonds. Those are the ways that we can separate these numbers apart and stick them back together. When we write a number in expanded form, we're going to write each individual place value and separate each place value by a plus sign, the value of each of those digits. So we're going to write our 2, which is worth 20,000. Our 6 is worth 6,000. Our 3, the value of that is 300. Our 2, the value of that 2 is 2 tens, and then we have our 1. So when we write an expanded form, here's what it would look like. Each of the values of those digits is separated by a plus sign. So we have 20,000 plus 6,000 plus 300 plus 20 plus 1. Let's take a look at our place values in a little bit deeper of a version. This chart shows us our different periods and that our different periods are separated by a comma. This chart also shows us that each period contains a hundreds place, a tens place, and a ones place. So if we were to look at a different number, let's say we had the number 503,780, we would take these individual digits and place them into our table. So we have 503,000, and right here, notice where that period ends, I say the period name, so 1,780. If I wanted to identify the value of these different numbers, I can use this chart to help me too. My 5, it's in my hundred thousands place, so this would be 500 thousands. My 3 is in my 1,000s place. This would give me 3,000s. My 7 here is in my hundreds place, and it's in my ones period. I don't have to say ones, so my 7 is 700. And then my 8 is in my tens place, so 8 tens is also known as 80. This chart is really helpful when I'm breaking these numbers apart and sticking them back together. And notice each of these 3 number sets is separated into what we call periods. Our thousands periods and our ones periods are really the periods we're going to focus on. And it's a little confusing that there's a comma at the end of a period, but that's what they call it. So we have our thousands period and our ones period separated by a comma. When we meet the end of our period, we use that period name. So 503,780. Okay, let's go back and look at those 3 different ways to write numbers again. We're going to use this table to help us. Now we have standard form, word form, expanded form. This number right here is already written in standard form for us. So we have one of those forms down. We have standard form, word form, expanded form. So we're done with our standard form. Let's focus on word form. Again, this table is really helpful when it comes to writing in word form because we can use the different indicators to help us make sure we're writing these numbers the right way. So we're going to focus on a period at a time, and that's super important when we're writing our numbers, when we're writing them in any form, but especially in word form. So we focus on a period at a time. So we're really just going to start by focusing on these first three numbers. 503. That's how I'd say these first three numbers. So that's what I'm going to write in word form. 503. Notice there's not an and in there anywhere. We don't say and. 503. Now, before we move on to the next set of numbers, we have to say the period name. 503,000. Then I can move on to my next period. 503,000. Now I'm going to say my next three set of numbers. 780. Okay? And that's all there is to the word form aspect of it. You write it just how you would read it. And it's very, very important that we say that period between our two sets of numbers. It's a lot easier to read numbers that way too if we break them up by those periods, by those commas. So read the first part first, then read the second part. That way we'll be able to read that number fluently. Our last piece is expanded form. And we do expanded form by breaking our number up by the value of each digit. So let's start with our 5. We always start with our greatest place value. Our 5, what's that worth? Well, it's in the thousands period and it's in the hundreds place. So it's worth 500,000. Then we put our plus sign. Our next number is a 0. That's worth 0 10,000s. It would be super silly if we wrote 5 zeros. So whenever there's a 0, we can skip over it and move to the next digit. Here we see a 3. It's in the ones place of the thousands period. So that means it's worth 3,000. Put my plus sign. I move on to my next digit, which is my 7. It's in the hundreds place. In the ones period, which means it's worth 700. Put my plus sign. My next number is my 8, and it's in the tens place of my ones period. It's worth 80, and it has a value of 8 tenths. And my last number is a 0, so I don't even need it. So here are my 3 different forms of my numbers. I have standard form at the top. That's the normal way we write our numbers. I have word form, and I have expanded form. Now that we know what all 3 of our forms are, we have standard form, word form, and expanded form. We are going to focus on how do you go from one form to another if you're not starting at standard form. So let's take a look at this word form and see how we can turn our word form into standard form and expanded form. Okay, we have the number 607,830, and we need to turn our word form, which is the form we have right now, into standard form and expanded form. Now, it's generally easier if we turn it into standard form first, since that's the number form we're used to seeing the most, and then turn it into expanded form for there. But you can choose which order you want to go in. I'm going to start with standard form. Now, what I want to do first is figure out how many digits I'm dealing with. I have 600, and that's in the thousands period. So I know that I'm going to have 3 numbers in my thousands period because I have hundreds, and this is my hundreds part of that period. And then I have to have 3 more digits in order to finish up my number. So here is my ones period, and this section is my thousands. Okay? Now, putting all these little marks ahead of time really helps me make sure that I don't just start writing numbers and then skip something. It's really easy for me, especially if there are going to be some zeros in my number, for me to skip over that 0 and then start filling, and then my number's not as big as it should be. So having these little marks helps me fill in all of my numbers. Now all I have to do is go ahead and start filling things in. My 600 is in my thousands period, so I'm going to write a 6 in my hundred thousands place. Now, when I read this first part, and again, I'm only going to focus on one period at a time, so I'm going to focus on this part right here. 607. How would 607 look? Well, 600, my 6 would be in the hundreds place, and my 7 would be in the ones place of that period. And I don't have anything in my tens place, so I'm going to put a 0. 607,000. I'm going to read that period and read that comma and say the period name. 607,000. So that's my first part. Now I can move on to my ones period. I have 830. So I'm going to go ahead and fill that section in. 830. What does that part of that number look like? 800. 8's in my hundred place, and my 3 would be in my tens place, and 30. So there we go. I took my number from word form and put it into standard form, and before I started writing any numbers, I put my little marks down so I knew all of the place values that I have to fill out. Then I focused on one set of numbers at a time, one period. I focused on my thousands period and then moved on to my ones period. So that is my standard form. My last form is expanded form, and it's generally easier if we go from standard form right to expanded form and try not to do it the other way around when we have word form first. That way we can see our whole number. So we're going to go ahead and do expanded form next. And with expanded form, we break our numbers down by place value. My 6 is in my hundred thousands place, so it's worth 600,000 plus. I don't have to do anything for my 0, so I can skip that. And I move over to my 7, which is in my thousands place, and that 7 is worth 7,000. Add my plus sign, and I move on to my next number, which is my 8, and that's in the hundreds place of my ones period, so that's worth 800. Plus my 3 is in my tens place of my ones period, and that's worth 30. And that's my expanded form. So I have standard form, word form, expanded form, and that all started from my word form. Let's take a look at one where I start with expanded form and then I have to change it into word form and standard form. So we have our standard form, word form, and expanded form, and this just helps me remember all of my forms so I don't forget one. And here is our expanded form. Now, just like the last part, it's easier for me to go from any other form to standard form than it is to the other forms. So right now I'm starting with expanded form. That's what they give me, and I'm going to move to standard form. Standard form is the way that we're used to seeing numbers, so it's really the easiest next step. I'm going to do the same thing, the same process that I used back here when I wrote my numbers in standard form. I'm going to start by putting my little lines so that I know all of the place values I'm going to need to fill out with numbers. Now, it's easy for me to tell how many places I need by looking at the greatest placed value number, the number that's worth the most. In this case, I'm looking at my 900,000. That's telling me that there are going to be 6 place values that I'm going to have to fill something in for because that's my greatest number I'm starting with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my marker, you're going to take your pencil, and I'm going to write down 6 lines. I have 6 place values in my standard form. Again, here is my ones period, and here is my thousands period. Okay, now I can start to fill in my numbers. all I have to do is look at the value of those digits. My 9 is in my hundred thousands place. My 4, the value of that is in my 10,000s place. I don't have anything in my thousands place, so I can put a 0. I don't have anything in my hundreds place, I can put a 0. My 8 is in my tens place, it's worth 80, and then my 5 is in my ones. So I filled out my number. From here, I can read my number. It's a lot harder to read it when it's in expanded form than when it's in standard form. So from standard form, I can read it and then write it into word form. I have 940,085. So that's what I need to write for my word form. So I just finished standard form and I'm going to move to word. I have 940. And before I go any further, I need to write down my period name because I just focused on my first period right here. 940,000. Now I can move on to my ones period. And when I read that second part of my number, just this piece right here, all I have to read is my 85. Okay, so now we've gone from, when we started off, we went from standard form to word form to expanded form. Then we went from word form to standard form to expanded form. And lastly, we've gone from expanded form to standard form to word form. It's just really important that we break down these numbers by periods when we read them and when we write them. Go ahead and try a few.